So good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture. It's the week before spring break. Next week is the 2-year anniversary of this pandemic where we went away from campus and are slowly making our way back. And it's all kind of a new normal, but we're finally really getting back to normal. I expect by the time spring break's over, none of us are going to be having to deal with the mask anymore, which is pretty exciting. Not official, but I'm looking forward to that. And I know you are all too. Here's the other thing that's coming, and it's I think timely to say this because I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. I think you're all exhausted. We're all tired of the pandemic. We're all tired of the spring semester. Everybody's ready for a break. It's tough right now. Last Friday, I sent off the final letters to the National Architecture Accrediting Board for our processes there, both for Canon USA as well as Wenzhou Canon University. This has been a long time coming. They went off at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then at 8:15 in the morning, I left for Trenton, where I met a group of our faculty and a group of neighborhood activists, designers, people from the university's administration and the Watson Institute to talk about how we can actively engage with building new communities around New Jersey. And it was one of those moments for me when I finally sort of felt like I had a chance to look up and sort of get rid of all the stuff on my desk and all those letters and all the 2020 conditions and the 2018 criteria and everything else that's there, all this minutia. I mean, it's still there. This is Canon after all, and there is going to be some level of that. But it's also a moment to sort of say, we really are a school. We really are. And this morning, that was reaffirmed to me because I talked to the CEO and chairman of Prudential Insurance in Newark, which has 50,000 employees around the world. And he'd done his homework before we met. And he'd been on our website, he checked us out, and he said, you're really making a school there, and you have a lot to be proud of. And the opportunities for us now to get beyond this kind of marker, accreditation is like a driver's test, right? You got to have a license to drive, but how you drive and where you drive and what you drive to and the things you care about and what things you want to do, that's all in front of us now. And we're just about to embark on that. We've got a full school. We've got wonderful faculty. A group of them were there in Trenton on Friday. The rest will be invited to participate as well as we build and ramp this program up. So this is where we are. So enjoy the break, enjoy getting some time off, get rested up, because when we all come back, and especially going forward, it's going to be just opportunity after opportunity for us, building on the values we set into place, which we're recognized for, the talent of the faculty who are here to guide us, and the commitment of all of you as students to be part of that. So I just couldn't be happier to be here. This is sort of my little fireside chat, I guess, every couple of weeks or so to tell you what's going on. But I want you all to know that something special. It's great to be part of it. With that, I'll turn it over to Craig to make the introduction of tonight's speaker.
Okay. I have it on a cell phone. Okay, so we're pleased, and I think these have been so interesting to see what our faculty has been up to when they're not teaching. So Gabriel Fuentes is an assistant professor here at the School of Public Architecture, and he coordinates the Master of Architecture program. So some have him in your future. Previously, he was assistant professor of architecture at Marywood University School of Architecture, where he developed and coordinated the 4th-year integrative architecture urban design studios and the architecture history and theory curriculum. And that was a new program as well. His research interests are at the intersection of architecture, aesthetics, politics, and especially as these participate in world-making projects such as heritage, utopias, modernities, imaginaries, and revolutions, etc. Along these lines, his teaching and writing focus on ways in which architecture reconfigures scales and territories of architecture, sorry, small phone. Reconfigure scales and territories of power, identity, and culture. In 2020, it was awarded the ACSA Buell Center Course Development Prize for Architecture, Climate Change, and Society for Unthinking Oil, a collaborative course that brings together expertise from across Kane's academic disciplines in the environmental sciences, humanities, and architecture. His writing has appeared in Future Interior, Log, the Journal of Space Syntax, and Efflux Architecture, for which he proposed canonical versus non-canonical, a collaborative syllabus written for the Theories Curriculum Syllabus Series. He directs the New York City-based Design Action Studio for Research, Architecture, and Urbanism, a research-based practice that operates across scales and publics. And with that, I want to welcome Gabriel Fuentes.
Right, I realized I should have. I realized I probably should have given you the user-friendly version of that. Well, yeah. This is going to be a little awkward because I tend to move around a lot while I speak, but then I have a microphone and then I have people on Zoom. So we'll sort of see how this works out. But thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction. Thank all of you for being here. I know we are at a point in the semester where we are tired. I mean, I think Dean Moni made a comment not too long ago about how tiring February is in academic life. And so, you know, there's a lot buzzing around the building. You have mid-reviews and exams and all kinds of stuff going on. Certainly world events, you know, is wearing you down as well. You know, it's exhausting, but you're here. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I really love the idea of an in-house lecture series. Actually, I think it's a great opportunity just to see, you know, not only what my colleagues are up to, but for you all to see what your professors do when they're not in the studio or in the classroom. So in a weird way, I feel like this is, in a sense, my introduction to the school. I've been here since 2019, so 2.5 years. 2 years of that have been through a pandemic, right? So in a sense, there's a sort of weird detachment, you know? So the opportunity to just sort of chat and, you know, discuss some of my activity outside of the classroom and how it integrates into the classroom, I think is really important. So thank you, Craig, for doing an in-house lecture series. So what I want to talk about are positions, pedagogies, and research. Specifically what my practice positions are, how these fold into my teaching practices, and how research sort of pulls all of that together. I don't see these three tiers as separate, actually, and I hope that'll become clear in my talk. Right? I see them as integrated and interrelated. I'll start with my practice positions. Right? In other words, the sort of guiding principles behind what I do and why I do it, and my sort of worldview on, you know, architectural practice, teaching, you know, architectural research, etc. And of course, positions are sort of situational, right? So you develop a position from a specific vantage point. So just some overarching ideas, right, or positions on, you know, positions that I take regarding my work and whatever facet that work is. One, practices are more than professional, right? There's more to architecture than a professional practice. Now, by that, I don't mean that professional practice is any less important. On the contrary, I think one of the values that this program gives you is that you have a pretty robust professional practice curriculum, right? And I think that's something to be proud of. But I believe firmly that architecture has many forms of practice, right? There are just simply many things that an architect can do, or many things that a designer can do, right? And it doesn't all necessarily need to be tied to the sort of economics of practice or the business of practice or the legalities of practice. They can certainly involve them, but they can sort of expand them and weave in and out of those, right? I think that's important. I think that's really powerful, actually, because the world is so complex, right? And so I say often that architects are kind of like the last generalists, right? The academy, the university is very much about specialization, right? You got to specialize in this or specialize in that. And architects are kind of fluid, right? Architects can sort of do a lot of things for a lot of people, right? And it's centered on the design of objects, but it's also, as I hope will become clear, more than just the objects we make, right? So you have design, or what I call undesign, right? Architects can add and remove, right? So usually oftentimes we overlook that, right? That architects also have the ability to undesign things or to rethink things as they exist. They're writing, publishing, activism, organizing, teaching, consulting, in general, what I call worlding, right? Which is a more philosophical term, but the reality is, I think architects, the power of the architect and the power of architecture is to create worlds, right? To envision worlds. And this is a complex thing, and it can happen across a lot of different media. And this is a question that I get. I remember, working on some research and sort of describing to a friend what I was doing. And this was a response, what does this have to do with architecture again? I'm working on, a paper that looks at the military industrial complex and how it sort of feeds neoliberal capitalism and how that is, hegemonic to our everyday cultural practices and sort of on and on and on. It's like, what does that have to do with architecture? I would argue it has a lot to do with architecture if you make it, right? If you sort of figure out how it connects, to our sort of spatial and building practices, right? So up front, I'll say, for me, architecture is a spatial politic, right? It's very much about buildings. I love buildings. It is very much about the design of buildings, but it's also about the spatial politics that ground buildings, right? That situate buildings, that contextualize buildings, right? And other kinds of architectural objects. Practices, and any kind of practice, are always situated, but they also always situate, right? And they're just sort of back and forth, right? Situating meaning practices are grounded in the world, right? You practice, whether it's design or writing or music, whatever it is, you practice it from a specific vantage point, right? You bring to the table your sort of histories, your dispositions, your desires, your biases, right? I work a lot with maps, right? And I always have this sort of conversation with people. Maps are not objective representations of things as they exist, right? There's a politics to map making such that the mapper has agency, right? In how maps are presented and what they present, right? So there's the world, the earth is a sphere, right? It took someone to divide it and say, this is north, this is south, but there's no objective north and south, right? These are sort of techniques of mapping and representing it. So any kind of practice, I would say, is always situated and it always situates, okay? And this is important, I think, for you all to think about in the context of your own work. You have positions, sometimes they're stated, right? This is my project statement. This is my project concept. This is, what I want to do, etc. There are dispositions, which are things that you do, but you don't state, right? There may be sort of motives behind that. There are oppositions, things that you oppose, right? Should architects design every building type? Or are you on ethical grounds opposed to certain building types, prisons, etc., right? I think these are all part of the discourse. You've got motives, perspectives, histories, desires. I guess my point is that for me, the practice of architecture is an incredibly personal process, right? It's very much about placemaking, world making, and it entangles multiple histories, including your own, right, or my own, whatever facet of design you're working. So I'll say a position that I always take is that there is no architecture without aesthetics. There is no architecture without politics. When I was a student, the saying was there is no architecture without theory, right? There's some truth to that, right? I think theory helps us sort of define what architecture is, what it might be, right? Or as, you know, Mark Wigley would say often, right? What architecture could, should, or should not be, right? Anytime you make that statement or you take that position about what architecture could, should, or should not be, it's theoretical. But I'm going to add to that, right, or maybe disturb it, I don't know, right, and say that architecture always involves, to any act of architecture, aesthetics and politics, and not aesthetics limited to form, right, although that's certainly a big part of it, right? But aesthetics in the sort of deeper philosophical sense of the term, aesthesis, right? Which is to say you experience the world before you think it, right? Before there's theory, before there's a cognitive exercise of defining or recognizing or recognizing, there's an aesthetic experience of the world, right? And to the extent that architects can foreground and background through acts of representation, right? Through discourses, through the way that you all construct your renderings, right? The scenes that you make, the way that you present your projects, to the extent that there's always that foregrounding and backgrounding, there's always that space where aesthetics meets politics, right? It's always an expression of power in the sense that it's always an act of inclusion or exclusion, right? And in fact, architects exclude much more than they include, right? There's always that sort of space, right? I think this is a zone where aesthetics meets politics, and I think every act of architecture involves or includes that in some sense. Architecture is but a dot in a web. Just sort of imagine it, right? Picture a dot and then picture a web. Maybe a more appropriate term is a mesh. Actually, I was on my way down here thinking maybe web is not the best term. Maybe the better term is mesh, which ecological theorists like Timothy Morton sort of use to describe an ecological condition of interconnectedness. But in any case, the point is, you know, architecture is an implosion, right? Architecture building, a building, right? A building project is a really sort of condensed implosion, right? It's an object, it's a thing. And there was a time in our discourse where, you know, in the not so distant past, where the autonomy project was sort of raging and the discourse was always about the thing itself, right? And the sort of internal workings, internal mechanisms of the thing itself, right? But that thing is always situated, right? As I said before, right? And I think if we understand this, we might open up the possibility that architects design not only the thing, but also the web or the mesh of relations that hold the thing in place, right? And so, you know, this opens up a space for architects to get involved in a political process, in an activist process, in advertisement, other modes of design and writing. You know, it opens up, I think, a wider spectrum of things that an architect can do. I'll be bold and say there is no autonomy. There is no architectural autonomy. Autonomy can exist as a discourse and has its uses, right? Much like literature, right? You can sort of talk about the autonomy of literature, but at the end of the day, to divorce architecture from its political field, right, just opens up more problems than it solves, right? And so I think architecture is a sort of small dot in a larger mesh. It also challenges us or encourages us maybe to be more humble about what we do, right? Architects don't only speak to architects, right? Architects speak to all kinds of people, right? And I'll remind everyone, we're in a school of public architecture, right? And I think we should take that very seriously, not just as a name, but also as a practice, right? As what we do, right? Even in your own education and in your own pedagogy, right? Architects speak to all different kinds of people, right? And architecture affects all different kinds of people in publics. So in this sense, as an extension, I'll say relation of form matters just as much as forms of relation, right? Let's not get bogged down in the wordplay there. It's a sort of typical decon move to sort of take a phrase and flip it, right? And sort of find the slippage in between that. I won't bog you down with that kind of, discourse that's lingering from, let's say, the 1980s. But let's just say that we design both the object and the relations, right? The connections, right? We can be a part of a broader political process, right? And then, of course, the dot and the web are where aesthetics and politics meet, right? If you can sort of visualize that and imagine that. The dot and the web are where we find architecture's flows, frictions, and gaps. And this is sort of leading into the next part of my talk, or the next, my sort of subtitle. Flows, frictions, and gaps, right? I think architectural practice or architectural practices are about, at least in my work, it's really about finding those flows, those connections, those moments where things don't necessarily align, right? Or cause some kind of internal tension, right? Or quite simply gaps, right? Or missing middles, right? Things that are there, are present, but aren't spoken or fly under the radar, right? And this is the reason why my practice tends to be more horizontally driven. I sort of easily slip back and forth between design and writing. Actually, lately, I've been devoted mostly to research and writing, which is sort of unintended, but I'm sort of loving that space, right? And I can do that because I don't feel one takes away from the other, right? I think it's all about finding these connections. So our modernist heroes are complicit, right? And so I'll pause here and say complicit in what? For the most part, modernism, or the aesthetic practice of modernity, we can say, envisioned a techno-utopia that was premised on a so-called clean break with the past. You may have heard this expression in some of your history classes. If not, maybe you will as you study modernism. Now, I love abstract modernism just as much as the next person. My education, and to a large extent yours as well, is sort of built or rooted in sort of modernist pedagogies of abstraction. Think of what it is to put a grid over a site, right? Or to work within a grid, right? It's just as much about putting something on the site as it is about erasing a site, right? The moment you put a grid over something, right? The sort of architectural act par excellence. You're in a sense saying the site is secondary to this organizational system that I will then, design on or transform, right? This is a sort of legacy of an abstraction, or, an abstraction process. But I think we need, quite frankly, less heroism, right? There's a sort of legacy of the heroic modernist that on his own, and I use his very specifically, right, very purposely, on his own will sort of come and save the day, will transform society, and will sort of discipline society to a sort of new modern way of living, right? There's no more disciplinary tool than a glass box, right? If you're in a glass box all the time, you're on your best behavior, right? So transparency is a sort of interesting disciplining device. I think we need less heroism and more, less abstract heroism, more concrete humility, right? I think there's something to the humble practitioner. We need architecture that builds empowering relationships, not necessarily shiny detached objects. We need structures of listening, right? Structures of listening, not necessarily silent, albeit transparent walls. We need urban strategies that empower people, not master plans that discipline them. And we need inclusive practices, right? Practices that are sort of open to multiple discourses and multiple ways of viewing the world and multiple ways of being or existing in the world, right? And so this is an image of Robert Venturi receiving the Pritzker Prize. I think it was 1993. Bob Venturi is an amazing architect, but where's Denise Scott Brown? right? I'd almost be afraid to ask if anyone in the room, aside from your faculty, has heard of Denise Scott Brown. Okay, I have some hands, great. But for a long time, the sort of heroic male architect was sort of foregrounded at the exclusion of, other voices. In this case, Venturi Scott Brown. Denise Scott Brown was a very powerful force, and for a long time was not recognized as having a Pritzker Prize. Right, it was written as Robert. So I think things are, they're sort of, and this is not to say that architectural history is bad. Please don't. This is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, there are legacies, in our legacy, right, of architectural modernism and postmodernism, there are things that are wonderful, that we still talk about, that we still love, right? I'm a formalist at heart, but there are things that we also need to really rethink. And I think you're the generation to do that, quite frankly. And I'll talk a little bit about, my thoughts on generations and, theory about where you are, what dot you are in that sort of complex web of generation theory. I think there are things that we need to really sort of rethink. Okay, so these are just some positions that I hold, some principles, right? Not saying these with any kind of authoritative tone, but just principles that I subscribe to, and that sort of animate, what I do, right, or sort of underwrite or underlie my work. So what I want to do then is move on to a discussion on some of the work that I'm doing in terms of teaching. Okay, now, just a note here. I'll sort of be half unscripted and half scripted. One of the benefits of being asked to do one of these lectures is that you actually have to sit down and say, okay, what have I done? How do I present what I've done? And how do they all relate to each other, right? And so in that sense, it was sort of interesting for me to see where those overlaps are. So I have a sort of almost a collage of different presentations that I've given in the past in conferences and such, and some of it is scripted and some of it will be off scripted, and we'll see, we'll figure it all out. I want to talk about some views, some of my positions on teaching, right, and pedagogy, and some of the work that I've done on that front. Some of it, well, most of it, right, which makes its way into your classrooms, right? Mostly right now in the graduate program, but a lot of this sort of makes its way into what I discuss in seminars and in studios and things like that. So the first thing I'll talk about is my work for theory is curriculum, right? Theory is not sort of a hot topic, at least not as much as it was a couple of decades ago, right? There's a sense that theory, you sort of spin your linguistic wheels while the world burns, while the world crashes and burns, right? So this sort of slow cognitive process of thinking things through is sometimes at odds, right? Or we can say there's a friction, right? There's a friction between the process of theorizing as a sort of detached exercise and a highly intellectual exercise, and being engaged, right, in the world, right? And as I've been thinking about that a lot, right, because my background is very theory based. Right? I love architectural theory. I write it, I read it, maybe even more than I should. And around 2018, I received an email out of the blue from a colleague, I think some might know, Joseph Bedford, who teaches at Virginia Tech. I get an email out of the blue, and Joseph says, hey, I'm doing a workshop in Italy. We're going to discuss theories curriculum. Do you want in? Right? All I heard was workshop Italy. Yes, absolutely. I'm in. Right? Of course, I'd love to spend 2 weeks at a Palladian villa, talking about theory, and of course, wine and food and, what can possibly go wrong in that scenario. But this is part of a workshop for the GAHTC, Global Architectural History, Global Architectural Teaching, I can't, GAHTC, someone, yeah. Anyways, it's an organization dedicated to sort of understanding the global implications of architectural history, right? And so here we are. Whoops, let me go back here. So here we are, this is us, Villa Saraceno in Veneto, Italy, sort of discussing the state of architectural theory, how we think about it, how we teach it, how it's relevant for you all in the room, right? How you sort of engage it in ways that might be fundamentally different from the way that, my generation may have engaged it. There's us having dinner. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm back there somewhere. For some reason, I'm always in the back of these pictures. I'll throw out some names here just to give credits. Participants included, and these are some of my colleagues and young professors that teach in other institutions. Matthew Allen, Joseph Bedford, Elisa Denez, Antonio Ferdrelli, Joseph Godlutsky, Rix Hoekstra, Jeremy Lecomte, Jake Marayal, Ginger Nolan, Brian Norwood, Yvonne Santoyo Orozco, and Marika Trotter, right? So that was the group. The question was simple. What's the role of the global in theory, right? Over the past 20 years, there's been a lot of movement in architectural history to sort of understand the global implications of architectural history, and theory has been absent from that for the most part, right? And so the question was, well, what is the role of theory, right? How does theory negotiate this thing called the global, right? And how do we sort of move it beyond a model that only talks about canonical ideas or Western ideas, right? My argument, and I sort of proposed this, the outcome of the workshop, by the way, was simple, is to in groups propose syllabi for architectural theory courses that can then be shared publicly. So it becomes a sort of collaborative project. These were published in eFlux in 2018 under the broad umbrella of theories curriculum. You can actually go check these out if you want. It's still online. But these are just sort of open source syllabi that can be circulated and used. My proposal was to look at the canon, right? And to sort of understand this sort of linkage, right? Between what we call global and and the canon, right? And the consensus seems to be that global history expands history so that it's beyond the canon, right? And somehow the canon of architectural history, right? But by which I mean, by the way, when I say the canon, those are those buildings and texts that serve as exemplars, right? These are the buildings that you read about in your architectural history classes, and the sort of texts that are assigned that are sort of seen as grounding the discourse, right? And that somehow the idea of a global, the idea of globalizing that means to expand it beyond the canon. I was a little uncomfortable with that. I think there is a necessity to look beyond the canon. But my initial reaction was, the canon is not the problem. The problem is what's in the canon, right? So it's not about escaping the canon, but sort of understanding the canon in relation to what's excluded from it, right? Aesthetics and politics, right? The canon of architectural history and theory has the effect of including and excluding certain things from the discourses. You never read an objective history. You read a history written by a historiographer, right? History is produced, right? And so if we can produce a history one way and we can produce theory one way, we can sort of produce it in other ways. And so I won't go over this entire text, but just parts of it, because this is sort of part of what was proposed. Theory exists in relation to what it excludes, and what it excludes is rich theoretical territory to be explored. Navigating this territory, we acknowledge the right for a canon to exist while rejecting its exclusion of indigenous and non-Western voices. Doing so allows to disrupt the distance between canonical and non-canonical architectural discourse, right? So it was proposed as a syllabus that would look at canonical texts, the texts that we sort of rely on to ground the discourse, with texts that can be considered non-canonical from other voices, right? Some of which is architectural, some of which is not. And this is sort of what made its way, at least up until now, right, into the graduate theory course. We sort of discussed these ideas in the graduate program, what will be for you all History 9 eventually. sort of repackages reorienting architectural theory, right? It's sort of reorienting practice that decenters the canon, doesn't exclude it or erase it or devalue it, just sort of reorients it and recenters it. Yeah, and of course, a product of this was a book, you know, and I wrote a chapter for the book theories curriculum. Not the syllabus wasn't what was published, but it's an essay that I wrote, sort of in defense of architectural theory, but also in defense of rethinking what it is and who it's for. Right? And so for that book, I wrote generational shifts, criticality, and the relevance of architectural theory today, in which I look at metacritical shifts in thinking that are really a product of differences in generations, right? When I started thinking about this, it wasn't very common actually to talk about Gen Z and boomers and Xers and things like that. But I think now there's a sort of recognition, right, that most of the room, I think, are Gen Z, right? I don't know if I'm mistaken, right? I heard someone say Gen Alpha. I don't even know where we're at. Is that right, Rose? Okay, so this is Gen Z still, right? Okay, so this came about because faculty talk, and we talk amongst each other, and we usually talk in the spirit of like, how can we reach you all better, right? And I can tell you right now that a lot of our faculty meetings are really geared towards like, how do we teach you all? Like, how do we reach you better? How do we engage you? And there's always a danger that we teach you the way we were taught, right? Which is one of the biggest mistakes probably that a teacher can make. I've learned through experience, right? By having done that myself, right? Like a sort of projection of ourselves onto you. We have to realize that there are a lot of things in history that repeat, right? Cyclically, but there are a lot of differences in generations and the way that you all are grounded in the world. And so what I started realizing in teaching these sort of seminars and thinking about what it is to teach theory in a school of public architecture was that media grounds you all in different ways, right? I don't know, like maybe some might disagree. That would be okay actually if they did. We can sort of have a discussion. I wonder if the right way to teach theory is to ground you all in books and essays, right? Hard copies of books and essays, right? You should read, right? But you're engaged in the world differently. Your world is more mediated, right? And I think this is very much a product of, this sort of generation. Right? And so I wrote this really in defense of theory, but also in defense of you, right? In defense of Gen Z, right? I don't know if I can't read this on my screen, but this is a Jane Austen quote, right? I believe I drank too much wine last night at Huntsbourne. I know not how else to account for the shaking of my hand today. You will kindly make allowance, therefore, for any indistinctness of writing by attributing it to this venial error, right? And the text version is, thanks for your text last night. I ended up getting totally maggoted. My hands were still shaking this morning, so if any typo, that's wrong, right? And I think, when Le Corbusier wrote Towards an Architecture, he wrote it in the style of a telegram, right? When you read Towards an Architecture, you're reading a text written by an architect that's presented to you as one of the modern masters, written in the form of a telegram. And when people that were well-versed in literature read it, said, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know how to write, right? When Alberti read Vitruvius, he said the same thing, right? Alberti said, that Vitruvius is neither Latin nor Greek, like I can't understand, therefore, I need to write, a 10-book treatise on, correcting Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture, right? There's a sort of pattern here where modes of expression change and generational conflicts sort of emerge, and it's usually sort of dumbed down, right? It's like, well, Generation Z is either the dumbest generation or the smartest, right? And those that would argue that Generation Z are the dumbest would say, well, they can't write in complete sentences, and they're distracted, and and those that say Gen Z is the smartest will say, yeah, but they're hackers, like they can hack into the Pentagon in 5 seconds, and so there's a friction and a gap there, right? I think there's an argument to be had on both sides, right, for every generation, right? But there's a gap there, there's a friction there that I'm really interested in, right? Not in solving it, I'm not interested in language of solutions, but I am interested in understanding what these gaps are. So I looked into, this generational theorists named Neil Howe and William Strauss, and these are sort of historian and economic economists, and they write about generational theory, right? They sort of have a theory on how generations, what they call generational turning, right? And basically generations turn every 20 years. And there's a direct correlation, right, between your generation and the generation 20 years ago. And they sort of developed the model, right, of what these means and how history sort of almost repeats itself cyclically without, repeating itself specifically, right? The paper traces collective and metacritical shifts in architecture along this model, Howe-Strauss generational theory model. And I look at, I sort of trace the history of architectural theory and the pressure points, and I situate them within this model. And these are symptoms of a broader generational shift. Seen this way, the so-called problem or death of theory should not be misconstrued as an outright lack of criticality, right? There's a thought that Generation Z doesn't think critically, right? And I look at the ones marching, after school shootings, and I look at the ones sort of fighting for, the climate, the sort of 16-year-old climate activists, and I say, yeah, there's something wrong with that assumption. So the idea behind the Howe-Strauss generational theory model is that history is a pendulum, right? It doesn't sort of move in a straight line, but it sort of moves cyclically. And they have a sort of model for that. It's circular. And they basically say there are four turnings. Generations turn 4 times before they complete their cycles. And they sort of relate this to a sort of climactic model. So you have what they call the first turning. And they liken them to mild springs, and these are generations that are part of a high period. There tends to be high optimism and strong collectivism. I trace this back to post-war modernism. If we think of what was going on in the 40s and 50s, sort of optimism about how to reuse wartime technology and domesticate it, and this sort of collective optimistic practice of building what would come to be understood as the American dream. For some, a nightmare. We see the the images in the background. Obviously you have Farnsworth House, Mies van der Rohe, right? You have some other images that are sort of a product of this time. The emerging critique of Siam or modernist urban planning. At some point, someone thought it was a good idea to break the city into 4 programs and keep them completely separate. And you have others like Aldo van Eyck and the Team 10 crowd that was sort of directly critiquing these Siam ideals. So an emphasis on collectivity and space and optimism. Then they have what's called the second turning, which they call a sort of awakening period. And this is a period in their model where there's angst and volatility, right? So you think of the hot summers of 1968, the hot summer of 2020 could be another one. This is a sort of age of early postmodernism or a sort of early critique of modernism, the age of critical theory, the riots of 1968 in Paris and New York and other parts of the world, which sort of leads to a sort of rethinking of a lot of things in society, the Vietnam War. There's so many things that you can sort of talk about in this period that would sort of lead to moments of volatility and angst. Out of this is born critical theory and the sort of resurfacing of Marxism in architecture. There was a time when architects sort of lamented the failed promises of modernism and became so self-reflective that the autonomy project is sort of born of this obsession, right? It's sort of understanding where and how architecture failed and how to never do it again. In the background is Manfredo Tefuri, which basically said architecture was doomed, right? There is no architectural criticism, only architectural history. And the sort of doom and gloom of architecture never being able to escape capitalism and the rise of a sort of negative critique and the oppositions moment, right? And if none of you are familiar with oppositions, go to our library in the graduate studios. There are quite a few of them there, and pick one up, right? And just sort of see what this moment is about. Then they call there's what they call a third turning, right? This is the age of the culture wars. You know, the age of Deleuze, yeah, and sort of thinking about the virtual, an age of weak collectivism and the rise of neoliberalism, right? So think of the 90s, right? Of course, the background is Mark Wigley and Peter Eisenman, who's had, I think, multiple phases in his career, but Wigley, theorists like Mark Wigley, sort of born out of this moment, the rise of deconstructivism, which is the architectural version of deconstruction, the literary theoretical type. And these are some of the images, you know, like I remember in the 90s, I'm a product of the 90s, very cliquish, right? Very much about individuals, right? You were either a goth or a punk or a hip hopper, you never mixed, right? You wouldn't be caught dead listening to the same music your parents listened to, right? There was a sort of real age of individualism. This is The Breakfast Club, by the way. It's the only film to have been filmed in one specific space, right? And this is sort of a snapshot of what the 90s was kind of like, right? The sort of individual, you know, sort of moments of individuality, right? The rise of MTV, right? You know, grunge and mall rats and skaters and punks and gangster rap. And then they have the fourth turning, which they call winters or crisis periods. And they argue that this is where we're at, right? Like this is sort of the generation that we're at now. It's really sort of, you know, when it turned, who knows, but very much a product of this are things like 9/11, financial crisis of 2008. These are the things that you remember, right? These are things that are at a distant past for you probably, but that I think still are sort of underneath a lot of the ways that you see the world, right? Financial crisis or housing market crisis of 2008. The rise of a sort of managerial view, a post-critical view of architecture, right? Architecture was about innovation. The critical project is exhausted. And what we need are new modes of practice that sort of tap into business models, right? And so you have the rise of the post-critical movement or the projective movement, which is really a product of an essay written by Bob Somel and Sarah Whiting in the early 2000s, something about Doppler. And then more recent past, you know, images that I think are sort of a product of the way that you're sort of grounded in the world, right? This is the latest one. This is the 40-mile convoy headed from Russia through Belarus into Ukraine. So even up until the moment, right, we're sort of in this, right? They basically say that you can sort of go from high periods to crisis periods, and crisis periods in their model are periods in which there's a sort of rebuilding of the world, right? This is a speculative idea of history, right? I'm not saying this with any kind of authoritative, you know, position, right? But that you rebuild the world during these moments of crisis, right? And my argument or my view in that paper was that that's where you are, right? You're at this sort of crisis moment, right? And you may not realize it or not, but a lot of what underwrites, right, the way that you view the world through architecture, the way that you're taught architecture, the reasons you're passionate about architecture, is because you find yourself in this moment of crisis and you want to do some good in the world, right? And architecture becomes a way of engaging the world. This is a very, very different way to engage architecture than, for example, the way that I was taught, right? My product of my generation, right? Very different, right? Architecture is a dot in a web, right? The web changes and so does the dot, and it's all interconnected, right? And I sort of view then Gen Z not as dumb or smart, but as optimistic, right? Maybe critically optimistic. And I've been told that using the term optimism might be a way to sort of hide or overlook, right? Like all the bad that's happening in the world, but I don't care, right? I'm optimistic about what architecture can do in the world, and what your angst can sort of channel, right? And that's sort of my argument, right? That given this, theory has a fundamentally different purpose for you, right? Theory for you is not about lamenting the failures of modernism. It's not about this deep questioning of why modernism could not bring about this new utopian world that Corb talked about, right? It's about engaging the world in a very real way, right? You're a generation of hackers, right? I wrote, whereas boomers and Gen Xers use theory to disrupt neoliberalism without any real hope of overcoming it, Gen Z is intellectually agile and forward thinking rather than withdrawing into autonomy. They seek immediate material consequences for their actions. And so the media conditions how we understand the global, right? The images that you consume are your connection to the world, and hence the images that you put out, right? In an age of TikTok and Twitter, right? And activist trading and memes, and the images that you put out in the world also make the world, right? And so I think this makes representation a very, very important part of what we do in very, very significant ways. It's not just about drawing a building, right, or a plan. It's about representation as worldly, right, and as world making. To make theory relevant, we must acknowledge that Gen Z is a platform generation. Their systems of meaning, or your systems of meaning, are in constant flux precisely because you're grounded pragmatically in the world and digitally mediated, right? You're sort of on both sides of the screen, right? And it's going to be interesting to hear your comments, right? Because it feels kind of awkward to tell you about yourself. Like, I feel like I'm overstepping in a weird way. I feel like that immediately disqualifies me or puts me out of tune, right? Like the moment you're saying you are this, it's weird. But anyways, I'm talking about my work, right? And my work is about you. So, theory then, I think, has the benefit of being both historically grounded and critically distanced, right? This is the sort of benefit of any kind of theory, but architectural theory, right? Thinking about worldy, right? It's that it's historically situated, right? It's grounded in the world, but it's also distant at the same time, right? And you have the ability to be both, right? Very grounded and very distant, right? There's a flickering, right? The world is so flat that what is historically grounded and what is distant sometimes is blurred, right? Which I think is a really, really powerful condition. It enables architecture to operate from the middle in, to engage a world from a uniquely disciplinary position with the same intensity that it does the structural conditions that frame and enable it, right? So architecture is a dot and a web, right? And rather than a top-down practice or a bottom-up practice, we might be better off thinking about middle-in practices, right? Which is to say that architecture, that dot is always an intervention, right? And theory is about theorizing, right? Or writing, right? Spaces of writing are about opening up those spaces for intervention, right? And there are multiple ways of doing that. In a media-saturated world, information platforms condition the relational and representational dimensions of architectural theory, its sites and its pedagogies. The surface is the medium and the medium is the message, but who is the message for? What kind of message is architecture willing to engage or not, right? So there's a sort of flickering effect that I'm really fascinated by. And this made its way into, other pieces that I've written, a short piece, 500-word piece in Log 39 right after the election of Donald Trump. What did this sort of, it already seems outdated, right? We don't talk about post-truth anymore, thank goodness, maybe, but what the sort of the aesthetics of living in a world post-truth is and what the implications are for architectural theory. Okay, moving on, and I'm gonna go a little quicker because I want to try to keep this, a little less, well, I'm probably almost at the finish mark. Another project I've been working on is a project called Unthinking Oil. Public Architecture in the Post-Carbon Imaginary, which is a product or a course prize given to me and some colleagues from Canon, from the ACSA for the Architecture, Climate Change and Society, right? It's basically to develop or to co-develop a course that sort of looks at that interconnection. And what we proposed was to look at oil and energy, right? Which tends to be written out of our histories, right? How often do you talk about energy, right? In a way that is beyond the sort of technical, aspects of it, right? So obviously I'm a part of that, but I think it's worth mentioning it's a project done with Dr. Daniela Shebitz and Dr. Julia Nevarez, environmental sciences and social sciences, respectively. And it's part of an interdisciplinary effort. This is a Unthinking Oil workshop that I held, or that we held, I should say, in January 2021, just to sort of discuss the course, to discuss ways of talking about climate change. And ways, and this was, at a time, obviously, when we were grappling with the onslaught of Zoom, right? And how to transition and how to use, this kind of media in our teaching. This included faculty from sociology, architecture, environmental science, economics, business, sustainability, et cetera, to discuss, pedagogies and community engagement strategies. So what is it to unthink oil? The deepest underlying premise to the course is that climate change is not simply a Western problem or a technological problem or even an economic problem, but rather a global existential problem, a fundamental problem of thinking and existence. Therefore, before addressing the climate problem through some kind of techno-political maneuvering or green capitalist venture in the name of sustainability, we must understand climate change as a cultural problem, right? Not a techno-utopian problem, but as a symptom of a carefully calibrated neoliberal oil regime or petroculture that permeates all aspects of our physical, natural, intellectual, and effective lives. Oil hides in plain sight. We are an oil society through and through. Contrary to some anti-theory or post-political discourses, we contend that theory, and dare I say the critical kind of theory, the kind that dismantles and analyzes things at the structural level, is precisely what we need to untangle this web. Paradoxically, unthinking requires deep thought, right? And so that's a sort of, in a nutshell, what we propose to look at in that course. Only by unthinking petromodernity and its global infrastructures can we learn to see the world differently. We also hold that imagining a post-carbon society requires a radical realism that cuts through the hegemonic webs of power that shape collective life. In other words, what you see is not always what you get, and the emerging field of the energy humanities has a lot to offer architecture and environmentalism in its discourses. So in a nutshell, the course is an interdisciplinary course that proposes to intersect what's called the environmental humanities or the energy humanities with architecture, right? Whether it's design, history, and theory, right? The energy humanities is interesting, right? Because again, energy tends to be locked into the language of solutions or techno-science, right? And discourses of the energy humanities are basically saying, well, history is a cultural thing, right? Like energy is a cultural thing, right? Where's energy in our histories, right? And how many histories of modern architecture have you read through or studied or analyzed that has completely written out the energies that enable these histories to be, right? And so we wonder if it's really easy to imagine an end to the world. If it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, why not just do it, right? And so this is one of the fundamental problems, right? It's easier to imagine the end of the world. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism, right? And so there's a lot to disentangle in terms of how our energy systems are sort of, part of the sort of neoliberal capital regime. Right? These are clips of a presentation that I did, right? But there's a sort of connection to be made, I think, between the environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, and certainly COVID-19. And without going too much into it here, the argument is that this is a wicked problem, right? Every time we think we sort of have the pulse on any one of these issues, whether it's public health or, climate crisis or whatever, we open up, right, something else, right? It's like the smaller your world gets, the bigger it gets at the same time. Right, so what is to unthink and what is to talk about? We intersect architectural studies with the energy humanities in order to speculate openly and collectively on the broad political and aesthetic dimensions of climate change. Really, that's it, right? Climate change tends to be talked about through the language of solutions without understanding that it's primarily a cultural problem, right? We need to think differently and be on the earth and have a different relationship with the earth before we can imagine, ways out of climate change and ways to democratize energy and so on and so forth. Three things animate the course, right? The historical conditions of oil society, the infrastructures and apparatuses of petroculture, and the speculation about what the world would look like without fossil fuels, right? So this is an architectural problem for sure, but it's also a social problem, a political problem, an economic problem. Again, architecture is a dot and architecture is a web. Okay, almost done, promise. A couple of research projects that I think are worth mentioning. I won't spend too much time on them. Things that have consumed me lately have been the aesthetics of authenticity, right? Or questions of history, preservation discourses. And I've been researching Havana, Cuba quite a bit, right? I am born in Oklahoma to a Cuban family raised in Miami in a very different kind of Cuban culture than you would find in New Jersey or even in Cuba, right? There's so much political complexities, right, around the history, Cuba's history, right, and the sort of pressure points. 1959 being a very strong line and a gap that through my research I try to sort of work in, right, that line that separates pre-revolution and post-revolution. But I start with this quote. I start with this quote from Glenn Weiss. Run, jump, fly, sail, or swim ASAP. The Europeans and Canadians have already arrived. Everything is in motion for the restoration of the city. Arrive before the Cuban American money can flow. There's always this thought, right, that once the European money starts to flow, a city like Havana, historic city, historic colonial city, is going to sort of be, sort of gentrified. So it's sort of locked in between a vision of a ruined city that should remain the way that it is, or a gentrified city that sort of takes away its, that sort of has its charm stripped from it through the forces of overdevelopment. A city cannot be frozen in time, right? And there's this common saying that Havana is a city frozen in time because, after the revolution took power in 1959, a lot of the resources typical of socialist, communist polities, right? The resources went to the rural outskirts. The city was seen as a sort of center of colonialism and capitalism and all the ills of sort of capitalist society, whereas the poor lived on the outskirts. And a lot of the resources were put to the outskirts. And therefore, there's a saying that Havana is frozen in time. It's sort of crumbled. It hasn't gone through the cycles of overdevelopment of other Latin American cities. But this is a dangerous way to think of a city, right? Cities have to change. Cities are a product of the people that live in them, right? And so to museumize a city is dangerous, right? And counterproductive, right? And it's also a product of the sort of legacy of heritage, which is rooted in modernism, right? Or I should say modernity, right? Heritage is the other side of modernity in many ways. I talk about in the essay, which by the way was written for Future Interior, 2018, two ways of understanding heritage, right? As time frame or place scale. But what I'm really interested is in the construction of heritage itself, right? Who decides what it is? Who decides what has historic value and why, right? And what voices are included or excluded from these discourses? It unfolds, this thing we call heritage unfolds as a negotiation between histories that are narrated, collective memories, contested authenticities, often in context of power and national identity, right? So these things that are considered historic, right? We can even almost say canonical, right? Are a product of these forces, right? It's a product of a kind of thinking that history should be designed in our image, right? The background images are from Viollet-le-Duc. If you don't know who Viollet-le-Duc is, Nina Rappaport will probably teach you who Viollet-le-Duc is. But is an architect that reconstructed historic buildings in the image of what they should be designed like, right? In other words, the passing of history as something that is updated and brought into the future, right? And so I argue that these sort of heritage making processes are kind of like that, right? The sort of the design of history is to design the world in your own image. They involve social processes of signification and collective memories that are gathered, recollected, instrumentalized, often in political contexts. Okay, go through these a little bit. We can say that it's a multi-scalar project that involves the reorganization of a range of social institutional relationships that intersect at various geographic political scales. And I look at UNESCO, right? And I'll sort of work through these, but this is the criteria for UNESCO. To be considered a heritage object, you have to fit, or the object has to fit within this framework. And I'll spare you the wordiness of this. I'm certainly not going to read all of this, but it's sort of worth highlighting certain phrases, right? The process of turning something into a heritage object is a process of reorienting it, right? And assigning it different kinds of values that are really, about what's called sort of universal historic significance, right? And so I looked through this, and I look at the work of the Office of the City Historian in Havana. In 1993, after images of the collapsed Colegio Santo Ángel spread across the European media, Eusebio Leal, which is this person who's since passed, met with Communist President Fidel Castro to discuss preservation and restoration strategies for Old Havana. At that meeting, he proposed a capitalist socialist strategy to intertwine preservation and restoration, tourism, and urban development. If given autonomy and sole control over state-owned hotels and restaurants, he would loop the profits back to the city by funding restoration projects in Old Havana, right? So it's a system whereby the preservation of the city feeds into the tourist, right? Into the tourist sector, right? And so even the act of preserving or restoring the city becomes an urban development process, right? I was sort of fascinated by this process, right? Because it's not just a magic wand, right? That says you are historic, you are not, right? It's this whole process of revitalizing an old city, right? And of course, I don't have time to get into it, but it excludes the majority of the Cuban people from that process, right? Havana is a city that operates along two economies. You have the economy for tourists, you have the economy for the people that live there. The two shall never meet, and this is sort of by design. This is the sort of plan. And so it started, this was a site, by the way, of my graduate thesis project. This is the Plaza Vieja in Old Havana. The first time I went to Havana was for my graduate thesis. And when demolitions crews arrived to the plaza in 1996, they had planned to implode the central garage, which was designed in 1952 by Cuban architect Eugenio Batista. a Republican era building and space that did not fit the desired image of the old colonial charm. In its place, the Office of the City Historian not only repaved the plaza, but took steps to transform it into a space to be commodified for tourist spectacle, right? And some of these strategies included mounting a camera on the plaza's tallest building, affording tourists a panoramic view, opening formerly private balconies to tourists, setting in place life-size cutouts of Spanish colonial troops in uniform, and instructions via tour guides, right, on what to see and how to see it, right? So along with the museumizing of the city and the heritage practices that restore it, are all sorts of other kinds of practices that condition the way that you see the city. Okay, and this is sort of part of that process of converting, you know, everyday spaces into historic spaces. This is my latest project, and I don't have much to say about it because it's really just getting off the ground, right? But it's really where I fold my interest in Havana, in politics, in oil, and they sort of come together around this project that looks at, you know, what I call Black energy and the geopolitics of industrialization. Okay, and in a nutshell, just very quickly, right? Cuba had a very, very rich modernist legacy, right? Mies van der Rohe was in Cuba. It had a chapter of Siam, right, that was very active. You know, they had a very progressive pedagogy, right? That there's a sort of really beautiful modernist legacy, right? And modernist architecture in Cuba was very beautiful. But the discourse would have it that after 1959, everything stopped. In a lot of ways, that's true, right? Architects fled the communist regime, came to the United States. Practice was sort of subsumed by a Soviet model of centralized planning. Yeah, and so the idea of the architect as the heroic individual sort of ceased to exist, right? But my argument is that that doesn't mean architectural culture stopped existing, right? As most discourse would have it, right? And that there's a friction. There's a gap in the discourse, one, and there's a friction within architectural culture in the 60s and 70s, where architects are sort of reckoning, grappling with these radical changes, right? Grappling with the sort of institutionalized, the over-bureaucratization of architectural practice with the desire to sort of create a new world, right? With the desire to really sort of continue a modernist legacy, okay? And so my work lately, and I'll stop here, is at this gap, right? The 1970s, which is a missing gap in the history of architecture in Cuba, which would have you believe that modernism stopped in 1959, took a break, and somewhere around 1982, people became interested in the city again. And after 1991, when the USSR collapsed, we finally got back to the business of designing real architecture for real cities, right? And there's a gap there that I'm profoundly interested in. And the geopolitics of the Soviet relation and trade, right? Sugar for oil and machinery and the industrialization process is this huge entanglement that I'm just fascinated by. And that's what's consuming my time now. I'll stop because I think I've gone over time, but thank you. I'd be happy to take questions if you're not too exhausted. Okay, I got. Sure. So the comment was you appreciated the lecture, you thought about theory in a lot of different ways, but has it ever come up that maybe aesthetics and politics don't go together, right? Does that sum it up? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely, right? And I think these two terms are usually at odds, which is why I'm interested in their relationship. Right. I would say that the theater. I mean, if you just look at things like the State of the Union address last night, that there's a real theater to politics. It is all a performance. And in fact, your project presentations are usually performances, right? You get up here and you perform your projects, right? So I would say that in a very real way, there's an aesthetics to politics in terms of what you say and what you don't say, right? How you present things is just as important as what you present, right? That's a sort of broad, right? In architecture, I just think every act of architecture is political to the extent that it involves power, right? Like you draw a line, you're making a division between one side and another, right? You build a wall, you're creating an inside and an outside, right? In a very, very fundamental way, these acts are expressions of power. You make decisions, little decisions and big decisions, right? Every day in every aspect of what you do as architects. And to the extent that these decisions have the ability to include and exclude things and foreground and background and hide things and make things, exaggerate things, think of the process of making a rendering. I would say that's also an aesthetic act, right? So of course I'm bringing them together, right? It doesn't follow that they're neatly, terms that belong together. But I do think that in very real ways, any act of design involves both. I hope that kind of answers. Steph.
Yeah, great lecture. I really appreciate it. Being Cuban myself, also here from the history of Carolina. I'm actually whether or not you started to look at what politics of that. The Chinatown started to get like people have such a few but the Chinatown itself started to develop, but after 1999, actually started to crumble. Well, when China and Cuba opened up relationships, the first thing they did was money into the Chinatown into Havana. So I think it's that. And how it's on here on geopolitics.
So the questions for the those in Zoom. The question is regarding the Chinese connection, right, and the Chinatown in Havana, and if I've looked into that in my research at all. And I'll say honestly, no, I haven't. Like that's the straight answer, and I'm fascinated by it. My research is focused on the triangulation between, the triangle that includes Spain, the United States, and Soviet Union. Right, for the most part, just because I'm interested in oil politics, right, and the embargo, and the embargo was a way of manufacturing the scarcity that required, Cuba to look to the Soviet Union for oil and the sort of whole Cold War. But I would be fascinated to learn more. I would love to learn more from you, actually, about that, because it's.
I don't know that much, but I know I do really find that to be quite interesting. They left piece of the Franco connection. So like they want to stay in. So there's all this kind of truth that a lot of people are talking about. It's relationship actually to stay.
Right.
How everybody
Right. Yeah. Hey, Molly.
A wonderful lecture, Gabriel. Matt, thank you for the graduate program. I was particularly taken with the segment that dealt with pedagogy and sort of generational transformation. Really see the lines of my life, right? Each of the phases you start with, I have lived through all. And it was kind of interesting and sometimes fun to sort of situate myself in these things. And it's a kind of critical question for us as a school. How do we see ourselves in the country? One of the things I've been frustrated with, I'm actually reassured just something by the talk about to was the means of communication. And I think one of the things I grew up with was the fact that architects can have great conversation among themselves, but they didn't know how to communicate. Right? The rest of the world kind of never was brought in. And there were times when architects in the spirit celebrated the fact that the public wasn't allowed into that. Right? And it seems like it's different now. And I think that helps in a good way for me to see that and understand. The thing that came to mind is how we represent it. And I was thinking back, when Claudio wrote his treatises of architecture, he wrote it in Italian, not Latin. First treatise not written. He wrote it in Italian because it was a way to reach more people. I felt kind of vaguely reassured by the kind of means by which we convey information today. And that it's not what I grew up with. It's not about necessarily reading the book or the essay. And it's about the means of communication that I think our students actually are plugged into. Judgment that we have about this. Just an observation.
Sorry, can you repeat the observation?
Yes.
I repeat the observation, then I'll repeat it for
Here's the question. Who's doing this well today? Who understands where we are and in the world of architecture is doing it well?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that because I think we're well. First, let me repeat the question for the observation for those in Zoom. Who do I look to in this discussions of theory and the generational gaps identified? You know, who's sort of doing this kind of thinking and this kind of work and you know, I guess that sort of paraphrases, right? Like, and that's a good question. I found a great community with my colleagues in Italy. And I've got to say, one of the ways that I ended that trip was raising a glass. And I remember saying, you know, if this is the future of architectural education, I'm in the right place, right? Because it's a group of young, primarily young faculty, have one foot in each generation. Like I, for example, I'm probably too young to be a Gen Xer and too old to be a millennial. I'm sort of in between, right? Like and as a result, I sort of, you know, relate to both. But I think there is a growing body of young faculty who have recently graduated, right? And who are sort of in that space, right? That I don't have specific names, but I will say too, I also look to students quite a bit, right? And I think one of the things worth mentioning is that education, at least for me, it's a process of co-production, right? We co-learn and we co-teach. And I know I, for one, you know, there's a sort of toxic view, not among anyone in this room for certain, but I've heard it in other contexts and other places, right? That young students, you know, they're either distracted or they you know, it's like I said in the lecture, right? They can't write incomplete sentences and they, you know, they can't formulate a coherent thought, and you know, maybe, but I also look to them for for the energy that they bring, right, to the classroom and for their experiences. And I think there's a lot to be said for their sort of lived experience and how that should cause us or encourage us as faculty, as teachers, to reevaluate what we think, not why we teach it, how we teach it, right? Not what we teach, how we teach it. For me, it's an issue of how we teach. Right? So I don't know if that's a coherent response, David. I'd like to think that I'm trying to be among that group of faculty that are sort of taking these questions very seriously. But I know they're out there. I know I'm just amazed by my colleagues, you know, in other institutions that are having these kinds of conversations.
On the platform, I think that's the gospel part of
Oh, okay. I hope Richard got the question.
Cloud on a thousand fire.
Right on. Well, thanks.
Thank you, Gabriel.